What are some key differences between the Assembly and Senate in the California legislature? As you might expect, there are a number of differences between the two houses in terms of the process they use. Some of them are minor in nature. However, those involved in the process at the California State Capitol may want to be aware of some of these differences. Essentially, the two houses of the California legislature, as you'd expect, follow similar rules because they basically have the same roles in the legislative process as part of a bicameral or two house legislature. Here are some differences of note. It's not an exhaustive one. Leadership. The Senate is led by the President pro tem and the Rules Committee, whereas the Assembly is led by the Speaker. In the Senate, the Rules Committee generally has the same powers as the Speaker does in the Assembly, but there are a few differences. After COVID and the pandemic, some additional powers were granted directly to the Senate President pro tem, and thereby bypassing the Rules Committee, which had been the traditional power center. Confirmation of appointees. The Senate confirms specified gubernatorial appointments. In the Assembly, this role is limited strictly to the confirmation of nominees to fill a vacancy for a constitutional officer, in which case both houses of the legislature must confirm that appointment. Office budgets. Senate offices are usually given a fixed number of staff positions that they can fill with a specified budget allocation. On the other hand, Assembly offices are generally given an office budget from which they pay staff salaries and expenses. Jurisdiction of committees. Many committees are the same with the same name and jurisdiction between the two houses. However, there are a few differences. The Assembly has 33 standing committees, while the Senate has 22 standing committees. So one difference is in the Assembly, worker compensation bills go to the Assembly Insurance Committee. However, in the Senate, they go to the Labor, Industrial Relations, and PERS Committee. The Appropriations Committees. The Senate Appropriations Committee generally invites support and opposition testimony at hearings, even where the author waives presentation. The Assembly generally does not do so. Regarding their suspense files, historically, the Assembly Appropriations Committee utilized the subject matter. Now both have begun using just going through the bills by author, which has historically been the method used by the Senate Appropriations Committee. One difference remains, though. The Assembly votes to pass or hold a bill on suspense, whereas the Senate only votes on bills that it plans to pass off the suspense file. In addition, the Senate has Senate Rule 28.8, which allows the Appropriations Committee chair to place a bill directly on the second reading file on the floor without a committee vote if the chair deems that the bill doesn't have significant state fiscal impact. The Assembly Appropriations Committee doesn't have such a rule, but in recent years has begun utilizing its consent calendar to do something similar. Budget subcommittees. All of the Senate subcommittees historically meet around the same time on Thursday mornings, overlapping with a few exceptions, while the Assembly subcommittees meet on different days and times with very little overlap. Also, the budget subcommittees have similar subject matter jurisdictions, but generally different numbers. So for example, education is Senate Subcommittee number 1, but Assembly Subcommittee number 2. Resources, the environment, Senate Budget Subcommittee 2, and Assembly Budget Subcommittee number 3. Health and Human Services, Senate Budget Subcommittee number 3, but Assembly Budget Subcommittee number 1. In state government, it is the same. Both are subcommittees number 4, and public safety and judiciary are also subcommittees number 5. Bill introductions. Beginning in 2017, the Assembly began allowing a maximum of 50 bills to be introduced by each assembly member during the 2-year legislative session, while the Senate continues to allow a maximum of 40 bills to be introduced by its members during the same 2-year session. Bill referrals. The Senate generally does not refer bills that only call for a study or a report. The Assembly does refer such measures to committee. As a general policy, the Assembly Rules Committee does not hear resolutions weighing in on matters of foreign policy, but the Senate doesn't have any such a limitation. Amendments. The Assembly generally requires amendments to be submitted by 5 p.m. or the close of session the day before its amendment deadline. The Senate doesn't have such a rule. The Assembly also has a different interpretation of the constitutional 30-day wait period in Article 4, Section 8A than the Senate does. Once a bill has been referred to committee, the Assembly permits pre-committee hearing authors amendments to bills within that 30-day period. The Senate does not do so. Also, the Assembly has historically imposed a deadline for amendments to spot bills in order for those bills to be referred to committee. The Senate historically has not had such a rule, but during the COVID time period did begin instituting that rule. Some differences in floor actions. The Senate records votes by voice vote, while the Assembly records votes electronically on the board by pressing a button. The Assembly also allows its members to add or change votes after the vote has been announced, so long as the final vote has not been changed. The Senate does not allow that except for the President pro tem and the Republican leader. So on the Assembly floor, members are allowed to add on or change their votes for up to about 15 minutes after adjournment, again, so long as it doesn't change the outcome of the bill. Note that also on the Senate side, the Lieutenant Governor is the President of the Senate, which is largely a ceremonial role. However, the Constitution grants the Lieutenant Governor the tiebreaker vote if the Senate were to result in a tie vote of 20-20. The Lieutenant Governor, that is the only vote that the Lieutenant Governor can make. In the Assembly, either a motion or a bill that fails, that is a tie vote, meaning 40-40, it fails passage, that motion or that bill. On floor analyses, the Senate floor analyses list support and opposition positions of interested parties who have submitted letters. The Assembly floor analyses do not list any positions. Inactive files on the floors, bills taken off the Senate inactive file are returned to second reading. But in the Assembly, when a bill was previously on third reading and it was moved to the inactive file, it has a 1-day notice and is returned to the third reading file directly. Motions, there is a difference. In the Assembly, there must be a second to a motion before a vote can be cast. In the Senate, there's no need to second a motion in committee. So in the Senate, only the motion is needed and then they can proceed to a vote.